Welcome to the Petersen's Bowhunting Podcast. All bow hunting, all the time. Now, here are your hosts, Editor Christian Berg and Associate Editor Mark Demko.
All right, welcome back to the Bowhunting Podcast presented by Lancaster Archery Supply. It's going to be a great show today because we're going to be talking about public land bow hunting and more specifically, public land access, which is getting to be a bigger and bigger deal all the time. Is it not, Mr. Demko?
Absolutely. You know, one of the big concerns that always comes up from hunters, no matter where you live, is gaining access to public land, worry about losing spaces. And probably that's a huge deal in the West more than any place else.
For sure. And we've got a couple of guests on today's show that I'm excited to have. Two first-timers. First, I've got Mr. Land Tawney, who is the CEO of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, a group that's doing a lot of neat stuff for us throughout the country. Land, welcome to the Bowhunting Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. And, I'm a first-timer, but hopefully this goes well when we can come back.
Well, you don't know if you really like us yet, so just wait a while before you recommit. And also on the show today, I've got Eric Hansen, who is an attorney who does a bunch of work on behalf of the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. And you were with Kecker, Van Nest, and Peters somewhere out there on the left coast, right?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Happy to be here.
And also an avid outdoors person, Eric?
I am. I'm a hunter, an outdoors person. I'm one of these. I've been an outdoors person since I was a kid, but didn't become a hunter till about 10 or 11 years ago, and dove in deep once I got started. So kind of hard. You don't have too many folks teaching you about hunting when you grow up in Los Angeles. So.
Well, it's funny. I grew up in Rhode Island, and southern New England is pretty much suburbia. And it's funny because, I don't want to waste too much time on a rabbit trail, but same deal, right? I didn't start hunting until about a year after college. And so came to it as a young adult and kind of the same thing. I had gotten a journalism degree, ended up getting super into bow hunting, and ultimately made a transition from mainstream media into outdoor media. So point is, it's never too late to start. And I think actually we folks who come to it a little later have a different perspective, maybe a different appreciation than the folks who start when they're 8, 9, 10 years old.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also have a journalism degree. So we feel like we have a little kismet going here.
Hey, guys, to Land and Mark, Mark, I didn't, it's funny. Mark is our associate editor. I'm sure I looked at your resume when we hired you, Mark. What did you study?
Well, I did get a degree in English and journalism, but as you know, my career too took a different path. I started in the music and arts industry. So speaking of Los Angeles, I worked in music and arts for many, many years, but I'd always had a love for the outdoors, much like you. And I didn't start hunting until I was adult, but I think I was like 18 or 19. I didn't have anybody get me started. My dad had quit hunting when he was younger. And so I didn't get started hunting till later. It's interesting when you hear all these different stories, you think of, growing up with your father or another family member teaching you to hunt. And we've talked about that over the years.
Well, and I always say that Mark is the only hunting magazine editor that I know that has a picture with Boy George and has interviewed Jethro Tull and a whole bunch of other bands. So Land. Okay, we started the whole show with a rabbit trail. I got to ask you now, round it out for the fourth. You probably didn't work in conservation your entire life either. Tell me a little bit about your background.
I grew up hunting and fishing. Both my parents were first full-time conservation lobbyists at our state legislature. My dad was the first lawyer for the Elk Foundation for the first 10 years of their existence until he passed away. And so I've been around I grew up hunting and fishing, grew up on my dad's back, chasing elk on his back, chasing trout, and then ultimately started hunting and fishing at a very young age. And so osmosis, probably a lot of what happened to me. I got a wildlife biology degree and then started volunteering for an organization called the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And that was, that was 23 years ago. And so I actually, I've had some other jobs. I've built a lot of fence in my life. I have a PhD, a postal digging degree. But majority of my professional life has been in the hunting and kind of conservation space.
Well, so land is probably the most traditional of the four of us in terms of having had a background in all this. And he kind of came by it, honestly, it sounds like, through what his folks did, which just, there's a lot of passion there, obviously, for the outdoors, Mark. And it seems like this is a good time as we dive into today's main topic to remind folks that when it comes to passion, you want to thank also Lancaster Archery Supply. I had mentioned they present the podcast, and we want everybody to know that when you need something for your bow hunting adventures, you want to check out lancasterarchery.com. They've got the gear, they've got the knowledge, they've got the passion. And back to that passion, right? If you're a passionate bow hunter, you got to have somewhere to hunt. And that's a big thing for BHA. Obviously, I think you guys are you in Montana land?
Yeah, we're based in Missoula, Montana. That's where our headquarters are, but we have members in every single state. We've got chapters in every single state besides Delaware and Hawaii. And those two are coming on soon. And then we've got chapters up in Canada as well. So Alberta, British Columbia, and then Yukon Territory. So as you know, there's a lot more public lands in the West, but the idea is we're trying to make sure you have access to public lands and waters and the fish and wildlife habitat when you get there. And that's really a universal thing all across the country.
Yeah. And I know, you're actually pretty active here in Pennsylvania, where Mark and I are, where Petersen's Bow Hunting is based. I know you guys do a pint night every year at the Eastern Outdoors Expo in Harrisburg. So yeah, a lot of things going on around the country. And so the reason that we're on the show with these guys today, Mark, is BHA put out a press release here just recently, back in May. And a while back, maybe a year or so ago, I think Onyx and the group that you had mentioned earlier, Land, the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, I think had partnered on a kind of a geospatial study, if you will, where Onyx used all of those mapping capabilities that they've developed that, most of us take advantage of now on our smartphones while we're out in the field, but actually looked at, how much public land is there out there that's pretty inaccessible. And they came up with a figure of over 16 million acres of public land, predominantly, across the Western U.S., that is either wholly or partly surrounded by private land. And then of that 16 some million acres, about half, or 8 million acres plus, is something that I had never really heard about before until last month, is this idea of being corner locked. So you have essentially a checkerboard pattern of, and that's the other thing, being an Eastern guy, it's so weird out West. So many of your properties are literally squares or rectangles, right? And it's because, the government had time to plat all that thing out as the frontier developed, right? Whereas back east, everything is so oddly and irregularly shaped in terms of properties. But so many areas out west, you've got these checkerboard patterns. So you literally have, a block of 5,000 acres of public, and then private, and then public and private. So you got all these corners, these little inside corners that come together, and it's a real problem because private landowners don't want people crossing. And of course, guys like me who don't have enough money to go buy a ranch, we want to cross because I want to go from public parcel A to public parcel B. And I think that's my land in there, and you can't keep me out. And so then we have a conflict, right?
That's where I think the rub begins. And I think that one thing I'd like to make, clear from the onset is that, private property rights are very important. And we, want to make sure that we respect those private property rights. And really anybody that is willfully and wanting to trespass, they should be held accountable for that. They should really be held accountable for that. And what we really want is just the kind of public rights to be upheld, where we have, like you described, I grew up in Montana, but I didn't marry into a ranch family, and I didn't come from a ranch family. And so I depend on public land almost exclusively to hunt. And so all we want is just access to the public land that is already ours. And but I don't want this to be taken ever that we're trying to tread on private property rights, because that's the last thing that we want to do.
Well, Eric, why don't I throw it over to you to kind of lay the background? There's a particular case which was the subject of the press release that came out last month. Ended up writing my editorial about this for our August issue, which will be out next month in July. But basically there was 4 guys from, I think from Missouri, right? And they traveled out to Wyoming. Yes.
Wyoming.
2 different years, 2020 and 2021. And I guess they were elk hunting. I'm assuming they were elk hunting. And they used a little metal ladder to cross over a fence at one of these checkerboard corners. And I won't say anything more than that. Why don't you take it from there, Eric? Like, what did they do? What happened? And how did it, kind of become a test case, if you will, for this whole issue?
Sure. Yeah. So you set the background well. We've got 4 hunters from Missouri who wanted to come out west and do some big game hunting in Wyoming, and they used Onyx and to kind of pick out where they thought would be a good place to hunt, find some good tags that were maybe easier to get than others. In part, I think because there's a lot of private property in the area as well as public land in that checkerboard pattern that you talked about. And so the first year they go out there and they encounter this corner, and there's a T-post, and they kind of swing themselves around it actually. And the second year, realizing it was there, they build a ladder, fabricate a ladder to go over the post and chain. They were, the whole point was they're trying to be very sort of cautious about stepping on or treading in, private property. And so it set up the whole chain of events. The landowner who owned property sort of, in that checkerboard pattern mixed with the public land, asked them to be prosecuted criminally for trespass. There was a trial in which they were acquitted, and then he sued them for civil trespass. And that's the case that just wrapped up recently.
So a couple things about that. Obviously, okay, I mean, I got to play devil's advocate throughout this because there's a perspective from both sides, right? Like if I'm a private landowner, let's say I'm looking to buy a nice ranch out west, and there are several inholdings that are entirely compassed within my ranch of public land. So I got 500 acres there, 1,000 acres there. Man, I love that, right? Because I'm like, man, if I buy this private ranch, I'm also essentially buying all this public land too, because I've got it completely surrounded and nobody can get in there. It's like my own little sanctuary. And then, of course, you have these corners where you don't control all the way around, but you've kind of got it surrounded on at least 2 or 3 sides. And then sometimes these landowners will actually build fences if they have like a corner, right? So they'll build a fence to one edge of their corner from one side and the other edge to the other side, and it sort of meets right there in the middle. It essentially creates a complete fence that you can't cross. There's some legal issues there. I know I saw it in your probably in your brief that you filed in support of these hunters, but in the press release, a law that dates all the way back to 1885 called the Unlawful Enclosures Act. And they're not supposed to be basically putting up barriers to keep the public off the public, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the history of it's pretty fascinating. You've got folks, the government's trying to encourage people to move out west and settle. They want the railroads to build to get that to happen. So Congress divides up this land into this checkerboard pattern, hoping people will come settle it all. And they did in a lot of places, but a lot of that land out in the west, pretty arid. And so a lot of that land didn't get settled. And that's what became our public land in the checkerboard pattern. And then, like you said, you also had people sort of fighting over access to land and good land, and people running their cattle and their sheep, trying to fence off and enclose like huge portions of the land to keep other folks out. And there was violence and just all kinds of wild stuff that happened out there. So to try to tamp that down, Congress did pass this law in 1885 called the Unlawful Enclosures Act that says, you can't basically put up fencing or use force, threats, or intimidation to keep people from accessing public land. And it was applied a few times in court cases in the early 20th century, and then even a couple times in like the 80s and 70s. But this whole idea though of can you step over a corner still was kind of, and is in some ways still an open question. And this case is that with the Missouri hunters is the first step, I think, in getting some real clarity on the legality of stepping over the corner. I mean, it feels like common sense to me that you should be able to, you find your marker, there's little survey markers in the ground showing where these corners are, and you just put one foot in front of the other, step over it from public to public. And that should be legal, but it's it's a long time coming to get some real clarity on this issue.
Well, and again, it gets further complicated because, and I don't want to sound intelligent here. I'm asking these questions. I only know really what BHA put out in their press release and what I read in other articles about this. But like, there's also the legal notion that has been, I think, precedent set in multiple court cases that like the private landowners also own the air above their, I don't know how high, it's probably to a certain altitude, but, so even if they use a ladder and don't set foot, like what's the guy alleging? Like they swung their arm out to the side, and their arm passed through part of his airspace or what? And then what he sued, you mentioned the civil suit. You didn't mention the amount. He wants $7.75 million in compensation for lost property value. And now I'm not a lawyer, didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, but I fail to understand how 4 guys going over a fence on a little metal ladder could possibly have diminished the value of his ranch by almost $8 million.
Yeah, and the court didn't understand that either. So even before we got a decision on the, sort of the meat of the substance, the court had thrown out a lot of the opinions of the landowner's damages expert, because the basic allegation, you're right, is that like by crossing over this point, if your backpack, your shoulders, you have to go through the landowner's airspace. And the right to owning your airspace, I mean, this goes back to old England common law, before even America was founded. And so that's a very, you have these competing property rights here. And that's really what this case is all about. But going back to the damages figure, the court said, hey, this doesn't pass my, smell test here. How can they be liable for almost, $7 to $9 million for diminishing the value of your ranch if corner crossing is illegal, right? The only way your ranch would be diminishing value is if corner crossing is legal, and then that's not these guys' problem. And if they win, there's no way to get damages from them. They'd be the winners. So the court said, yeah, that's not going to happen. And then in a later briefing, the landowner said, okay, yeah, we're going to drop our damages figure. We just want to keep people from engaging in this corner crossing. And that's kind of how that came out.
So let's take a step back away from the specifics of this case and the ongoing legal arguments. And let me just ask you this, as an organization that represents a bunch of public land hunters across the nation, anecdotally speaking, I'm sure you don't have a study or any hard statistics, but how common is this corner crossing? Is this something that you get a sense that, especially, with the Onyx and other apps that we all have access to now, that there's probably quite a few public land hunters doing this corner crossing thing like every season? Of course, most of those instances of corner crossing go undetected, and it's just kind of, like Eric said, it's happening, and we don't really know, where it's all ultimately going to go.
Yeah, I don't have any exact science there for you. We haven't done a study on how many people are doing corner crossing. And I don't know how many people would answer that honestly either. But I do know, that this case, it was, highly watched by folks here in Montana, folks up in Colorado, folks down in Nevada, folks over in Oregon. Because looking at kind of, how this case goes, does it set precedent other places? And I think Eric can talk to that more specifically. there is still a bunch of gray area. I mean, the court ruled on the specifics of this case. And what has not been said yet is that, not only did they build this contraption to make sure that they weren't stepping on any private land, they also talked to the local warden. They also talked to the local sheriff and said, hey, we're going to go do this. We got this ladder. And they were like, go for it. And so they did this. And until that ranch manager called, what was it, the county attorney, I think 19 times, Eric, and basically harassed them. That's when the county attorney got a hold of the sheriff, and the sheriff finally pressed charges on them. That's those criminal charges. Now, again, as Eric said, they were acquitted of those criminal charges, as the sheriff already knew they would be. And so then the next step was really to charge them civilly. You brought up the $7.7 million. This has been a case of intimidation from the very beginning and trying to keep the public out of their public land. Again, nobody, these Missouri 4 did not want access to this private land. They just wanted access to public land. And so I think that this is an issue that people are watching very carefully. You mentioned, again, the Onyx study that they did with CRCP. Not the donutted land that's like 8 million acres, but the 8 million that's around, Corner Crossing. It's such a key place for us to potentially gain more access, or at least be clear that access is legal. And so to me, this is a question about a little bit about the haves and the have-nots. When you charge $7.7 million, you are trying to intimidate folks. And, one thing at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, as soon as this Missouri 4 was facing the criminal charges, as well as then the civil case charges, we didn't want them to have to pay for legal fees. And so we raised over $142,000 to help pay for those legal fees. I think we've got about $12,000 left of that. And now we're probably looking at an appeal. But 4 common guys from Missouri, right? And I think that they were really trying to, the landowner who's from North Carolina has a lot of money, was really trying to intimidate them. And this idea of devaluing the ranch, I think it's kind of been unsaid in the West for a long time, is that, okay, if you have limited access, that becomes part of the value of your ranch. Well, on this corner crossing piece, and with the public having access to that, we still have access to it. So it's not exclusive access. If you have a donut of private land, around some public land, that's a different story. But I think it's, it was interesting to me that there hasn't been this huge outcry from the private landowners in a lot of ways, like community, trying to support Mr. Eshelman. It's because they knew he was in the wrong the entire time.
Well, there's a really lot of things I want to get into, but quickly to sort of close up something on the legal issues, Eric, the thing about corner crossing is either on the state or federal levels, there's really no law that specifically says you can do it and no law that specifically says you can't, right? And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, I think that's fair, right? Because you have the right to access public land, but landowners have the right to prevent people from trespassing their land and even their airspace. And then that sets up this quintessential kind of fight, and it's a fight about, it also involves state law versus federal law, like the Unlawful Enclosures Act. The state law is what usually governs most property rights. And so you have these big kind of really interesting legal issues that go along with, sort of the boots on the ground, how is this actually going to affect people? And so, the court ruled that, in Wyoming, there was a case from 1915 or so, where a guy was trailing his sheep across some land, open land, and it was a corner locked land, and there was a property owner that says, no, you can't do that. And they sued him once he started moving his sheep over the land. And the court said, well, this looks pretty darn on point to what we're looking at. The court said it was an appellate court case. And they said, yeah, no, he's allowed to move across the public land, and, from point to point. And I mean, that's an even more wild case, because the guy's sheep were like 3/4 of a mile off on private land. And I don't think we'd get that same decision today. But certainly the court, looking at what happened there, said, well, at least in the minimal level that these guys were doing, if you're doing this corner crossing on foot, you're not touching private land, and you're not, harming private land, then yeah, they're good to go.
Yeah, and there's really a couple ways that this is going to ultimately be addressed, right? You've got the court cases, like we've been discussing, but then there's also legislative remedies. And I know land, like even I think probably as a result of all the attention created by this case in Wyoming, you guys recently lobbied legislators there in the state house in Wyoming to pass a couple changes. So you've got a new law that says you actually have to physically set foot on private land to be charged with criminal trespass. So you wouldn't have a repeat of an incident like this where these guys just, basically went through some air and got a criminal charge as a result. So you're trying to prevent that. And then also another change where a law that specifically prohibits people from posting private or public property, right, to keep people out.
Yeah, and I think, the ruling coupled with the two legislative pieces that you're talking about provides much more clarity in Wyoming. I think there's still more to do at a state legislative level to, I think, address the actual corner crossing, as we say, to make sure that we say that is legal. But that piece of legislation that was passed that said that you had to set foot was huge. That is huge. And I think the other piece, this intimidation factor of posting public land like it's private, that's exactly what that is trying, what people are trying to do. And so making that explicitly illegal as well, I think takes away some of the angst, I would say, from the public land users. And now, going forward, I think we'll be looking at future legislative sessions to think about clarifying it even more specifically.
Now, I want to take a bigger picture view here, Land, because as interesting as the corner crossing issue is, when you take all these 16 million acres as a whole, the 8 million that are completely locked behind the borders of private land, and then the other 8 million that are corner locked. And we think, okay, there's legal questions. We ought to work something out. But a couple things come to my mind. One, why aren't state legislators, Congress people in Washington, and conservation groups such as BHA and TRCP, maybe you are doing this and I'm just not aware of it, but why don't we have a national push to say, okay, we've got all these in-holdings and corner locked land. First of all, let's start with the in-holdings. Why aren't we doing land swaps with these private landowners and saying, if you have $5,000 of the people's land completely withheld, how about we just sell you that 5,000 acres that's already completely sealed off inside your borders, and we're going to get 5,000 along a border of yours so that we can still come out whole, or maybe we even give an advantage to those private landowners as a show of good faith. Hey, we'll give you an extra 1,000 or something, but there's got to be a more practical way to come up with ways to increase the accessibility to public lands.
Absolutely. So, and thank you for the question. So there is something that's already in place, and it's called the Federal Land Transaction Facilitation Act, which is a mouthful. But what that is to address exactly what you're talking about. And what the great thing is that if you sell, let's say, some public land to a private landowner, and you don't have, another piece that's set up yet, that money stays in one account. And so this is specifically for this. Is it going on all over the West right now? Absolutely. These conversations are happening. I think, the piece that you ended with is where the rub comes, like who's getting the best deal. The best deal is where everybody is happy. And that doesn't happen every single time with one of these exchanges. And so I think there's a lot of willing landowners out there that, they want to block up their land. The feds want to block up their land. It's easier to manage. It's easier to access. But then it comes down to kind of the values of these land and how that stacks up. And so it is happening. Another piece of legislation that was passed and now fully funded, it's called the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And that provides $900 million a year in perpetuity to do big purchases. One of the things they can do is do big purchases like this. So I think that's another option. The final option I would tell you that's already on the books is that a lot of these states have public access to private land programs. In Wyoming, it's called Access Yes. Here in Montana, it's called block management. In Montana, we have 8 million acres of private land enrolled in a public access to private land program. And so could you be utilizing these programs to either get at what you're talking about specifically, some of these inaccessible lands, or could that be used also to think about, corner crossing? And so I think all of these tools are in the toolbox right now. And we need to address conflicts that way rather than in the courts.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. You actually answered my follow-up question right there because, like I said, for the in holdings, yeah, let's just get rid of those. And then for the corner lock, yeah, I could see it, right? Like you talked about. First of all, kudos to Montana, Fish Wildlife Parks. I've hunted on a bunch of those properties. I've had success on some of the block management is an awesome program. I love that.
Green sign means go, right?
Yeah, I could see, man, just think of a little cattle chute in these corners. Like, could we have like an entire system of like corner crossing rights where it's like, there's a sign and it's like, this is your designated corner cross and it's like foot traffic only. And yeah, I mean, there's this little gate, right? And it's like you go through the funnel and back out onto the public. But yeah, those landowners maybe get an annual royalty for that or whatever. And of course, there's nothing to stop people. It's no different than leasing, right? I mean, somebody who has enough money and time could contact private landowners throughout the West and just negotiate individual agreements for the periods of their hunts. And it probably does happen, doesn't it?
Oh, it's happening all over. And I think that's, again, why public land is so important, right? Like, I think that leasing in the East is something that, is kind of very common, I would say. There's also a ton of public land in the East that I think people forget about. But in the West, I think leasing is becoming more and more of a thing. And so as that happens, these public lands become that much more important. I think something you just said that we're really looking forward to is really identifying where these corners are. As Eric said, there's like these survey markers that identify these corners, but making sure that those are more prevalent. And so again, that we, the people, the public, make sure that we're in the right area. I think the second piece to what you said is that, we as hunters and anglers, I'd be more than happy to pay for, permanent gates at these corners or permanent turnstiles that go over the top, or, a bridge, whatever it is. I think that, identifying ones that are really important, working with willing private landowners, I think, we as hunters and anglers will be willing to pay for that. So that's another solution that's out there. And to me, I started this conversation with really wanting to make sure that, the respect for private property rights and the role that private landowners really play in wildlife management, right? I mean, those lands, as been described, are kind of interlocked. And without good private land management, those herds look much different, right? And so we are working together, and I think there's only a few bad apples to try to push this envelope, both on the trespass side for, the average, man and woman, and then on the private landowner side to try to keep people out. And I think much more people are in this common sense that this is, right? Like, this is such a common sense issue. Let's have more conversations about finding a path forward in that kind of middle ground versus on the left or the right kind of fringes.
Yeah, I mean, we build bridges and tunnels for wildlife so they don't get whacked on the highways, right? And we why can't we build some bridges and tunnels and stuff for hunters so we can get from public to public? Mr. Demko, I've been dominating all the questioning, but I know that your brain has been churning, so I want to give you the opportunity to jump in here.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating topic. And Len, one of the things I was going to ask is, you're talking about all these different scenarios going forward. Is there a priority for BHA? Is there something you really want to try and focus on to maybe try and unlock some of these lands? Because a lot of the stuff you're talking about is probably medium to long range, working with legislators, trying to work on a federal level. Is there anything you think you can make some inroads in fairly quickly?
It's a great question. I wish I had that silver bullet, no pun intended, but I think that, for exchanges, these are all conversations that happen to have on the ground. I think the access yes piece is potentially, or the public access to private land programs, those are already in place. And so potentially that could be used pretty quickly. This is all kind of, it's still gray, right? And I think there's like this case provided some clarity in some ways. And so that's initiating these conversations, Mark. And so I think we will find out what is possible in the short term. And then, like you said, what is possible more in the long term, I think over the next 6 months to a year.
Yeah. And Eric, you mentioned, sorry.
No, go ahead,
Eric,
Mark.
you mentioned very briefly, you don't think maybe this is the end of it. Maybe there'll be an appeal or something like that. Is this something that you think could legitimately be litigated all the way up the chain? Is this something that, or do you think at some point the landowners might give up on it?
That's a good question. And, I certainly don't presume to speak for him, but I think he's definitely gotten all in, so far on this case, and the outcome wasn't what he wanted. And I expect there will be an appeal, which will go to the 10th Circuit. And then, from there, whatever happens, probably an appeal to the Supreme Court. Of course, there's no knowing whether they would take this case or not. They get thousands a year and take just a tiny few. So, certainly, though, I do think I would expect that we'll see this move up the chain on the judicial side as well.
Guys, what about on a practical level for the average hunter? How should the current state of affairs land guide my personal, actions and plans as I head out to areas where there's corner locked lands? And as sort of a second part of that question, what can I do, to kind of be involved and hopefully finding a good solution as a, rank and file bow hunter?
That's great. So I think, and Eric can answer the specifics too. I'm interested to hear them. These guys did everything right. Everything right. They contacted, the local sheriff, the local game warden. They built this contraption and they, did everything they could to make sure that they weren't stepping on private land. And I think that's why they got ruled this way in the courts. I would suggest that to anybody that is thinking about corner crossing right now is do exactly kind of follow the playbook that they utilize. And I think that, you're going to have, some states that are more amenable to that, or some sheriffs or wardens that are more amenable to that, and then others that aren't. We just had a director here in Montana say that, that it was illegal to corner cross, which was total violation of what they said in 2018 in a memo. And so I think there's like doing your due diligence, which we all should as hunters anyways, right? Like, it's not our fault. Like, I think the burden is on us as hunters to be in the right. And so let's do everything we can to be in the right. And I think that carries the day. As far as, what you can do as an individual, I think, small plug for Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, but I, really belong to an organization to make your voice bigger. And so it's $35 a year. We will keep you up to date on not only what is happening and kind of as these laws and kind of like different interpretations happen through the lawsuit, but we'll also help connect you. And so that we can, influence where these swaps are happening that we talked about earlier, state legislative efforts that are happening. We can keep you informed and so that you can engage yourself. We can't talk for you, but we can make it pretty easy. And I would say that, you come up against these forces that a lot of times have a lot of money behind them. We at BHA don't have a lot of money, right? Like that $140,000 that got raised by thousands of people. People like, it's rank and file folks gave money, $25 to that effort. And so what we have is the people. We don't have the money, but we got the people. And so I think, for anybody listening to this, you're always stronger in bigger numbers. And whether that's, work that we're doing in Pennsylvania right now or what we've been talking about here in the West, the more we come together, the more we get for ourselves.
Man, you started talking about those evil forces and you got me thinking about beer for my horses.
Wow. It's like, it's not even that time yet, but I hear you.
Well, you guys are out West. It's 2:45 here. I mean, it's getting close.
Good enough.
And Mark and I are leaving for Manitoba tomorrow for a bear hunt. So
awesome.
We're about ready to check out. I'm actually really glad we were able to get together today because I'm going to whip this right around and publish this as our episode for next week. And so, I mean, I thought it was fascinating, Mark. Honestly, Mark, wasn't this one of our better shows?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a topic that if you're in the industry, you hear about, but maybe if you're not following that closely, it's really fascinating to learn about this. It's not something that anybody would even think of. You think about it, somebody stepping over or using a ladder to go over from one piece of public to another. What could be the harm? Well, in this case, somebody wanted $7 to $9 million for the possible damages. It is fascinating. And I think one of the big takeaways from this is, support nonprofits like Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. They're doing great work. They're giving sportsmen a voice, but they're also helping to promote access to public lands, increase access. And these organizations have great volunteers behind them, great staff, but they need the support of everybody, support of you and I.
Yeah, and Eric, you don't work cheap, do you? I mean, you need lots and lots of people to join BHA.
I do, but I did all the work for BHA pro bono. So I'm a volunteer.
What a guy!
I'm a volunteer for BHA. I'm the co-chair of the California chapter. So I think volunteering is important in whatever realm is important to you, but people need to get back and do more of that.
Oh,
so
man.
this is where I kind of decided to put my energy and effort. So
Wow.
And just to be clear, so people are listening, they heard me talk about raising $140,000. We got $8,000 left. Eric just talked about doing this work pro bono, which he did, like when we did an amicus brief, which is basically a friend of the court, and like gave our perspective, I would say, to the court on this issue. But the lawyers that were actually with the Missouri 4, that's separate from Eric. And so I don't want to get that twisted, that we just took all that money. All that money went straight to those lawyers for the criminal case, as well as the case that just got I guess dismissed, right?
And I didn't know that Eric did all that work for you guys for free. I feel bad now, Eric. I take back all the lawyer jokes that we told before we started the show.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, I would just say that the lawyers for the Missouri 4, I think they did an amazing job. I've been following all this stuff very closely. So.
Well, gentlemen, again, I think 3/4 of an hour went by in a heartbeat, and it is a fascinating topic. As Mark said, we'll continue here at Petersen's Bowhunting to keep our eyes peeled for any further developments. Certainly wish you guys with the BHA and all the other groups that you work with continued success, not only to keep awareness of this out there within the hunting community, but as you work on various initiatives legislatively, to kind of try and, like you said, give a situation where there's clarity for the private landowners and the sportsmen, so that everybody knows what the rules of the game are, and we can try to all be ethical players within that game.
Yeah, I'd just leave you with one thing too. And, whether you become a member of Backcountry Hunters or Anglers or not, a lot of people think their voice doesn't count in this country anymore. They're pretty fed up with politics, right? And they just really don't think they have a voice. And I would say you're exactly right if you don't use it, right? And I think that we're not going to win every single thing that we engage on as the people. But if we're not engaging at all, somebody else is going to be winning all the time, right? And so to me, belonging to BHA, belonging to your local rod and gun club, just being engaged, like stop bitching and start a revolution. And really, that's about the way democracy works in this country. Said another way, you're either, at the table or you're on the menu. And we're not going to, again, win them all. We're not going to win them all, but we're definitely not going to win any if we're not at the table. So stop bitching and start getting off the couch and actually doing something about it.
Do you have any "Stop Bitching and Start a Revolution" t-shirts? Because if you, I was just saying, if you don't, you need some. And if you do, I just bought one. So would you please get those printed up and then sell me the first one, Land?
Sounds good. And I don't know if you're going to take I'm not even sell you. I'll give you one for free. Don't have to worry about the royalties, because this is now, on recorded.
Well, that's all right. It's trademarked now by Petersen's Bowhunting. All right, guys. Hey, thanks again so much. I loved it, man. And we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you guys so much, and good luck on the bear hunt.
Thanks for downloading the Petersen's Bowhunting podcast. All bow hunting, all the time. Pick up the latest issue of Petersen's Bowhunting magazine on your local newsstand, or connect with us online at bowhuntingmag.com.